Hi friends, welcome to week 2 in the second chapter of Elizabeth Johnson's Ask the Beast. And in this chapter, Johnson gives us the biographical and the social and scientific context in which Darwin develops his theory of evolution. And she starts by reminding us that his higher education began actually at the University of Edinburgh, where he was studying to become a physician. And he, for whatever reason, he didn't stick with the subject matter, and he transferred to the University of Cambridge to study divinity, actually to become a priest in the Anglican Church. But he was tempted and preferred rather to attend the lectures in geology and chemistry, and it was there that he honed his skills of observation and scientific method of the day. And this served him well because after his graduation, he accepted an invitation from Captain Fitzroy to be the naturalist on board the 5-year voyage of the HMS Beagle. And the mission of the Beagle really was to find a trade route around South America. But along the way, Darwin took copious notes, notebooks full of observations of species, animal and plants that he encountered across his travels. He went back to London with these notebooks and spent another 5 years mulling over the details as well as continuing observation in and around his home in London while he raised his young family. And finally, after those 5 years, published his theory, the basis of his theory, which came to be known as evolution, in the abstract called On the Origin of Species. But he always remembered that the real content of that theory came from his observation and his contemplation of the creatures that he encountered through time and space across his travels. And he remembered in this quote, "When on board the HMS Beagle as a naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the inhabitants of South America and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. The facts seem to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries." And there are two important things to take from this quote. And the first is that Darwin has seen for himself the changes in species through time and space. Time, because in the geological record, he could see the fossils, the change in the species, but also across space, because in the same amount of time, he saw species of plants and animals change as he traveled into different bioregions and different areas around the continent and the world. But then the second main point is that the leading research question that was at the heart of Darwin's theory is not about creation. It's not about the origin of life, but rather it's about the origin of species. So at the core of this theory, which by the 5th edition comes to be known as evolution, he puts forward these two ideas as the basic ideas that provide the foundation for his theory. The first is descent with modification, which is that the traits of species change or mutate over time, and the more preferable ones, the ones that are beneficial, get passed on to descendants. And the second is natural selection as the way in which that happens. So, as to the first, descent with modification, Darwin professed and admitted that he had a profound ignorance about the mechanism. Now, today, we know that it's genetics where these mutations happen, or at least where the change in the way that traits are expressed happen at the genetic level. Of course, Darwin didn't yet have genetics, the idea of genetics at his disposal, but he basically knew that mutation happened. We'll get to the dynamics of that reality later. But the second part of the second idea is about natural selection, which suggests that those traits which mutated or changed were determined as beneficial according to the natural conditions that were around them in the local ecology. So those individuals with traits that well disposed them to the natural pressures or opportunities, they survive to pass on those traits to their offspring. So the natural conditions selected or determine which morphological changes would be seen in the next generation. That's natural selection. So the really radical point here, the point of departure for Darwin, is that there is a natural mechanism for species change, not divine will or design. But we have to remember that this was not necessarily a challenge to religious leaders of the day. Rather, it was a challenge to scientists of his day, who claimed that Darwin was actually straying from the prevailing scientific method. So scientists like William Paley tended to just deploy explanations of natural theology, which is they looked at nature in order to deduct divine attributes or to deduce divine goals. And according to natural theology, chance and mutability of creation, the changing of creation, were not among divine attributes. So the real challenge of Darwin's theory was actually against prevailing theory of the creation of immutable species. Now, geologists at this time had already begun to shake the foundations of these prevailing theories with the idea of impermanence, as meaning that the earth itself was changing. We could see this in the shifting geology, but also that revealed in the fossil record that there were actually changes in species that could be measured through time. But many scientists like Lamarck and Lyell and John Stuart Mill still believed that that change through time was due to multiple acts of special creation. So species didn't change, but they were created differently at different times in history. But now Darwin says, inductive reason tells me differently. Darwin, he writes, on the view that each species has been independently created with all its parts as we now see them, I can see no explanation. But on the view that groups of species have descended from other species and have been modified by natural selection, I think we can obtain some light. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes like those determining the birth and death of the individual. Natural causes, in other words. So it's important to know here, and it's important to always remember, Darwin is not arguing against religion. Rather, he's arguing against science. He was actually being scientifically humble and saying that scientists should only claim what scientists can according to what we can observe. And he was saying that Paley's prevailing theory was inadequate. And in fact, it's inadequate because it also claims too much about God. In fact, he says, species evolve over time and across space due to natural factors, and this we can see. Now, of course, this ends up having religious implications, and he was well aware of that, and we'll explore those in the next chapters. And indeed, Darwin himself in later life did turn away from the idea of a benevolent or loving active God and tend towards agnosticism, maybe atheism. But we have to remember that that personal turn in his faith was not really only due to scientific discovery. It was due to his own pastoral struggles in faith, with the loss of family members, and the most acute was the death of his daughter, Annie. And it's the fact that he had trouble reconciling this real-life experience with the idea of a good or loving God. But even with that pastoral crisis, in the end, Darwin clearly leaves room for the theory of evolution, which speaks of the origin of species alongside of the role of the Creator, whose laws and will to create life are not in conflict with one another. He merely wanted to acknowledge the truth and beauty of how that speciation happens according to what we can see happening in the scientific record. And understanding how that diversity came to be leaves us with no less divine awe of the mystery of life itself. And if you actually read on Origin of Species, you'll see how Darwin humbly holds these two together with a sense of wonder. And Darwin's wonder is where Johnson ends this chapter and where we end our reflection for this week. Because Darwin felt that nature was intimately connected with a sense of God. And being outside in the natural world, interacting with it, observing it, contemplating it, that filled his mind with feelings of wonder, admiration, and devotion, directed to the one who created it. It was sublime beyond words, as Johnson writes. She writes that heightened aesthetic gratitude, that response of gratitude to the beauties of nature, as he was comparing the life of the rainforest with the desert of Tierra del Fuego, seemed to Darwin, and these are Darwin's words now, as temples filled with varied production of the God of nature. No one can stand in these solitudes unmoved and not feel that there is more in man than the mere breath of his body. Here we see how contemplation is not only a scientific, but a theological method. This is what we were speaking of last week. This is how the agrarians see the land around them. This is how the prophets look to the fields and the mountaintops that they farm and mine and shepherd upon, and wonder about the presence of God. But they recognize that contemplation should not propose a kind of natural theology. As Johnson writes, we should see God in nature rather than primarily deducing God's existence from it, as did natural theology. It's a way of engaging our local ecology, and we have much to learn with Darwin, from Darwin's humble and honest engagement with creation through what we now call the scientific method of learning. But what I want to ask is that method of engagement necessarily any less faithful? Von Hugel's lecture tells us no, that in fact, looking outside of ourselves helps us to see the grace or the spirit of love. This is a theological method. So Darwin's theory on the origin of species came from a very disciplined, extended contemplation, observation of nature. And in the end, this is eventually the epistemological method of science. Not what's deduced from tradition or scripture, but inductive reasoning from observation. But going back to this theme of contemplation, this is not necessarily contrary to faith or to the methodology of theology. Rather, his observation demonstrated what Sally McFay calls a sacramental beholding. As she writes, this is a loving eye gazing upon nature, not an arrogant one. And that loving eye allowed Darwin even to affirm at the end of the second edition that there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms which continue to evolve. So Johnson reminds us that this theory on the origin of species begins with the words, when we look. So for now, we're going to talk about looking, and next time we'll talk about what he saw.